Tahani Mustafa, who is a senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group. Tahani, thank you so much for your time. Would it be fair to say that both Gaza and Israel right now, in this moment in history, are actually governed by radicals, and that therefore, because they're so radical, according to their own philosophies, that they just seriously can't reach an agreement because they're both, well, their main aim is to destroy each other?
I mean, I think that's an oversimplification. I think ultimately you do have one of the most extreme right-wing governments in Israel, but that's not necessarily far removed from previous Israeli administrations who have never recognized Palestinian people's right to exist. They've never recognized their political rights. For the last 3.5 decades, even spanning well back before that, any kind of peace process that has been offered to the Palestinians has usually been done so within a process of capitulation. It's ultimately been about managing Palestinians while being able to take as much land as possible. And that hasn't changed. And ultimately, the offers that are now on the table calling for a ceasefire are precisely that. It's about ensuring that Israel has control over the territory while managing the population within that. In the case of Gaza, again, Hamas is yes, it may be considered a radical element within Palestinian politics, but that's a very subjective lens to understand Hamas from. Hamas is ultimately a resistance movement, but at the same time, even though it has been subject to vast amounts of international pressure through a 16-year siege, through a decades-long embargo from the international community, a no-contact policy from Western states, it has managed to try and reform itself and moderate itself from within. We saw for a period between 2007 to 2012 where Hamas was willing to engage in talks with Israel. Unfortunately, Israel managed to torpedo that process at every turn, culminating in the point in 2012 where it actually assassinated the head of the person negotiating on behalf of Hamas, while he had those very papers in his hand. And that, therefore gave leeway for more radical elements that understood that conciliatory politics just doesn't work with Israel. Currently now in the West Bank, the PA is a really good example of that. Mahmoud Abbas, at the start of this recent onslaught on October 7th, denounced Hamas. He came out to claim that armed resistance, again renouncing armed resistance, claiming that is not a trajectory that Palestinians should be pursuing. And in return for that, Israel cut off tax revenues to the PA at a time where they're undergoing the worst economic crisis in their history. Not to mention all the restrictions on movement, makeshift checkpoints that have severely hampered the PA's ability to govern in the West Bank, as well as the economic hit that the West Bank has taken.
Tahani, regarding what's happening at the UN Security Council, do you think it's right for its members to be even talking about a two-state solution right now, or is that almost a distraction? Why can't the Security Council just make a decision about the most urgent need, which is to stop the Israeli attacks? If you start talking about the two-state solution, you're looking so far ahead, you might lose concentration regarding what's happening now.
I mean, the two-state solution is ultimately a talking point at this stage. I don't think anyone in the international community can realistically speak of a two-state solution with any seriousness. It's completely lost any political substance. And that goes back to the point about the fact that Palestinians have never been, their political rights have never been recognized. So we can talk about a two-state solution. We can talk about going back to the status quo. But everyone who has been on the ground for the last decade, forget the last decade, even just the last year, can recognize that is no longer viable, that you have an Israeli government, you've had successive Israeli administrations that have not allowed that to be a viable possibility. And that's precisely what had been part of Hamas's rationale on October the 7th. For Hamas, it was ultimately about trying to push forward a political process that could offer Palestinians some kind of political horizon where the current reality that is being offered to them is not the permanent status quo. And that's precisely what, when the international community and Israel talk about a two-state solution, is being offered to Palestinians. It is these pockets of land where they will never be granted the right to their own land, air, and sea space. They'll never be granted the right to their own natural resources. And so, again, that goes back to the point that two-state solution is just a talking point. Even a one-state solution at this point is a talking point, unless the international community and Israel recognize that Palestinians have political rights, and those political rights need to be respected in any kind of agreement reached.
Tahani, Mustafa, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.